sacrifice. Lord, take control, take control. Well, thank you so much for being with me on my daily dose. Today we're going to continue with a third installment of my heart transplant story. Now, if you haven't seen the first two episodes of this, I encourage you to go back and find those. They're on YouTube. They'll be on my website likewise, iftruthbetold.org. And you can find those things. And I'm, Lord willing, going to put some links beneath this program here so that you can find those more easily. I encourage you to go back and watch them because they really lay foundations to where we're going to begin today. Now, those episodes carried you from birth up until about March of 2010, and that's where we pick up today. Now, from 2010 to September of 2012, very little had changed. I'd had some strokes during that period of time, which made things more difficult, especially concerning my preaching. I'm one who likes to preach from memory and without notes, and so that became more difficult to do. But I was able to do it, and I pulled it off. It took a little bit more time, not just studying as I like to do, but prepping, trying to remember my facts, get the things in order, keep those things in order, the outline such as that in my mind. And so that was more difficult, but it just challenged me to work harder. And so I was really kind of thankful for that. Now, in September of 2012, I'd gone to the clinic, which was basically just a heart failure clinic I go to regularly. Of course, I'd been tested and at least evaluated for transplant several times, been borderline. But at that point in time, the doctors recognized some different symptoms and such that were a little worse than they were before. So they went ahead and placed me in the hospital to redo that transplant evaluation. Now, during that time, they discovered my heart had gotten so weak that I was going to need an IV medication added, which was going to put me at a status 2 at least on the heart transplant list, and it was going to be necessary for life. Now, they put you on that medication. It's called milrinone. I was supposed to be on that continuously. It was a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week drip. I was going to have to come home on that. I was kind of afraid of that. I didn't want to be the guy with an IV pole, kind of embarrassed out in public and such. But as it turns out, all of that is now contained with a little fanny pack that I wore, which was embarrassing to begin with, I understand. But as I got through that, I continued to come home with that. I had home health, of course, that helped me manage that. It happened to be that my home health nurse was a young lady I went to high school with, and she was an outstanding nurse to me, a good friend from the past and the present. So I was thankful for that. But at the very same time, it was something I had to learn to deal with. This is a medication that actually caused my heart to pump, squeeze. Of course, my pacemaker defibrillator I'd already had implanted several years back was actually sending out the electrical signals to cause it to beat. So now I'm basically on, at least in some forms, kind of an artificial type situation, kind of a life support, if you will. Not exactly, but kind of like a life support system for my heart. Now, things were a lot more difficult with that. I had a little bit more energy. I was able to do a little bit more, but it was just hard to manage, hard to keep up with those things. That was about September of 2012. Of course, I became listed on the transplant list officially then, and with that medication, I was able to do a little bit better. Now, if you fast forward, I was in the hospital a time or two between then and what I'm going to mention now, which was December. It happened to be December 25th. It was actually Christmas when it had been discovered I had a terrible infection. And this particular infection was one that turned out to be so severe that I wasn't going to get over it, it seemed like. I was in the hospital. I was having very, very high fevers, severe chills. I mean, chills so bad that I would look like I was having a seizure, convulsions. My whole body would bounce off the bed. These were so bad. And it was really just because my fever would go from normal to 102, 103, 104 in just a matter of minutes. We didn't really know what that was. Of course, the doctors drew a lot of blood work, did a lot of tests, several cultures, one of which came from my PICC line. And at that point in time, they discovered my PICC line was infected. But of course, that was on I think the 4th day I was there. You have to wait for these 72-hour cultures and such to grow. And even when they found it, they weren't sure what it was. The hospital had to call the CDC in Atlanta to even learn what that particular infection was and how to treat it. And as it turned out, the infection I had was commonly known to kill people within about a week, about 7 days. And so I'm 4 days into a 7-day lifespan, it seemed like. And I tell you what, I felt like I was going to die at that point. I wasn't really sure I was coming home. These things were awful. I mean, awful, awful to deal with. But nonetheless, they discovered that. They got a name for it. It's very long. I can't pronounce it. But I did do some reading on it. This will give you some insight as to how severe it was. The first thing I found on it at least came off a Google search, and it was from the Department of Defense. And what it said about this particular infection or bacteria is this: it has not yet been used in biological warfare. Now that implies to me that it could make a very good biological agent to hurt people or harm people in warfare, but it hadn't been used there yet. And so that's what I had. And these things, this infection could maintain itself and survive on surfaces for like 32 days after I had touched them or come in contact with them. So I was quarantined to a room, and all these things were happening very quickly. But finally, they discovered that the antibiotics, which were the strongest they knew of in the hospital there at that time, the antibiotics were just simply not going to beat it. And so they put me on one of only 2 antibiotics that they knew in existence. And of course, the CDC told them about this, which would allow me to come through. They put me on those, and I would say within 24 hours, I was feeling much better. Of course, I survived that episode. Now, that really woke me up. If it's not enough to be in stage 4 heart failure and to need a heart transplant and be facing all of that, now there's a potential for infection. Of course, I had to pull that PICC line, which was my lifeline at that point. They were having to pump those same meds into me via an IV, and I couldn't go home with that. So finally, they decided we're going to try another PICC line. And Lord willing, it would go well, and it did. God was with me. They reinstalled the PICC line, so I now have 2 scars right here, one from the first and the second. And that really made it able for me to go back home. Now, that was in about December of 2000, and let's see, that would be 2012. In 2013, I was in the hospital, and I believe January. I was in the hospital in April, in the hospital maybe a time or two that I'm not mentioning there. Anyway, several times. And then finally, it was on May the 2nd. Now, on May the 1st, let me just lay this out. On May the 1st, which was a Wednesday night, I had preached or at least taught Bible class at the Weaver Church of Christ. On Thursday, May the 2nd, I was supposed to begin my day by going to transplant clinic, being evaluated, doing the things they standard and typically do there. And then I was going to be actually leaving Birmingham, making my way back to Mumford to get the children from school. And we were going to Columbus, Georgia to spend some time with some friends. And I was supposed to speak on a lectureship on Saturday, and then on Sunday speak 3 times on a friends and family day or a homecoming event. So I was really looking forward to getting to do that extra preaching that weekend. But as the doctors came in, I told them about some of my complaints, which, as my wife and I jokingly say, I had to tell on myself. I had to tell them the way things really were, because my typical answer for everybody, my mother picks on me about this, is, "Oh, I'm fine. How are you doing?" "I'm fine." And here's a guy who's dying, but he's just fine. That's the way I face things. That's the way I dealt with that. But nonetheless, the doctors came in on that occasion. They said, "We're putting you in the hospital today, right now." And I was there with my mother. My wife had worked that day, and she couldn't always go to the doctor with me. And so she said, "We're putting you in the hospital right now." Of course, I refused. "I'm not doing that. I've got plans this evening for this weekend." And I kept trying to bargain with her. "I'll come back as soon as I get back into town Sunday. I'll be here, and you put me in then. Or I'll come early Monday morning, and you put me in then. Just don't put me in today. I've got too much to do." Of course, I was just wanting to preach, wanting to go ahead and make that trip with the family and such. But she kept telling me that wasn't happening. Finally, after my arguing for quite a while, I won't go into all the details, but she came back in, the doctor did, and threatened to remove me from the transplant list if I wouldn't go ahead and be put in the hospital that day. Of course, I had to give in to that. So I called my wife, called my family and some friends that were involved, got somebody to cover me for those speaking engagements and such. Cliff Goodwin did that at least on Saturday. Thankful for that. But I made arrangements, and I went ahead and went in the hospital. Now, here's what I knew. I knew when they put me in the hospital that time, this happens in the lives of many transplant patients, that I was being condemned there until transplant or death. I knew that. I knew I wasn't coming home. This was May the 2nd, and I wasn't coming home. And so I was going to have to live out my life in the hospital, or, if the Lord will, get a transplant, which at that point in time, the doctors had already told me, for me, it could be an 18-month to 2-year waiting period in there. And of course, now it's only been several months, I think about 10 months, and here I am facing a decision. Of course, I went in the hospital. We thought things were going to be much more difficult than they were. Of course, my wife had to hold down everything at the house with the children, try to keep them in school. My parents and others were a great help with that. I'm thankful to God for that. But here I was at UAB kind of by myself. Now, they came and visited as often as they could. Came over several times a week. Children came over on the weekends and such. But still, you're not at home, and you're not sure if you're ever coming home. So I'm kind of making a little checklist. I got a marker board there in my room that the nurses write on, and I'm marking off the days, the number of days I've been in the hospital and doing that sort of thing. But to tell you the truth about it, although I really, really miss my family, I kind of had a new family. over at UAB, especially on the HTICU floor, heart transplant intensive care unit where I was, the doctors, the nurses, the staff, everybody there becomes your family. You really, really grow to love these people. And still, I have a great relationship with all of those people, even the cleaning staff. People joke, I go over and I know all the cleaning staff. We're friends. We're first name basis type people. They check on me, I check on them. And so that's the type of relationship I had while I was there. But still, you're in a hospital and things are not looking good. Now, at that point in time, the doctors came in on one day and they said, look, you remaining a status 1B, which is what I was, you're not going to make it to transplant. You pushed yourself into the corner. You've gone as far as you can go. We have to transplant you as soon as possible. And the only way to do that is to prove that I was a candidate to be a status 1A, which put me at the tip top of the list. And of course, I knew that needed to happen, but I was afraid of how it would happen. Several ways I could do that were not possible for me because of my anatomy of my heart and such. There are several procedures they could do that would cause me to need that status 1A ranking or such. Man, I couldn't do that. So the only choice we had was to take the medication that I was already on, that Milrinone, and up the dosage so high that I could get what was known as an exemption. And that's what they decided to do. Now, here's the problem. That medication is very, very dangerous to begin with. I mean, to be on it, period, actually shortens your lifespan. Basically, for every day you live, it takes off about 2, if that makes any sense. And so it's not good to be on this medication. It's certainly not good to be on it at high dosage. So you're kind of between a rock and a real hard place because you want to live to make it to transplant, but you can't without the medicine. But by adding more and more medicine, you're shortening your lifespan anyway. So what do? Well, you go along with what the doctors say. And so every morning there for about 4 or 5 days, my doctor would come in bright and early in the morning. He really wouldn't ask a lot of questions. He'd just reach over to my IV pump, punch a few buttons, and raise that level. And when he would do that, boy, it would put you in a tailspin. For several hours after that, there'd be quite a bit of side effects from that. Of course, hot flashes. Some of you ladies or older ladies know about that. You experience that, a lot of discomfort. This medication was tough stuff. Your heart would pound, your heart would race, and it would scare you to death if you weren't really focused and had a lot of faith in God, which I tried to have. It would really, really cause some fear anyway. But they did that. Finally, they got me up to a high enough level where they could change my listing from a status 1A to a status, from a status 1B to a status 1A. And of course, that put me at the top of the list. Now, it was on May the 15th. Now, we've been in the hospital since May the 2nd. On May the 15th, the doctors came in earlier that morning and they said, you're NPO until further notice. And that doesn't mean a whole lot to anybody but me. But what I knew that meant was you're not going to have food or drink until we tell you can. And what that really means for a transplant patient is this. There's a heart available. There's a possibility you could be in surgery within the next few hours, so there's no more input-output. And so I kind of got excited about that. Of course, I had to begin to prepare for that. There's a whole lot involved in that you can imagine. But I went ahead and called my wife. I think I delayed a little bit too long because I waited about an hour. But I called my wife. I just want to be sure things were real. I called her and told her. Of course, she came over. My parents came over. There were 20 or 25 people who came over, mostly preachers and their wives and families came over. And we all stayed in the room together that day. And every few hours or so, they would come in and say, it looks like a match. It looks like a match. And they really got our hopes up. But later on, at the end of that day, and it's been a very long day. I mean, this process started early in the morning. We're talking around 4 or 5 in the afternoon. Finally, the nurse stuck her head in the door and she just simply said, it's not yours. And when she said that, I mean, basically everybody in the room except for me pretty much broke into tears. Most people just decided they'd go ahead and leave. They just left and they didn't want to be a part of it. Of course, they're supporting me, but they don't know what to say. They don't know how to handle that. They know of the disappointment, so they leave. Now, at that point, it was time, basically, I wanted everybody out. Everybody, my entire family, go ahead and go home. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. And, of course, I was able to stop and sit and think about that and pray about that. I recorded an episode of our Daily Dose then where I talked about the ways of God, how His ways are above our ways. His wills are different than ours, and so that wasn't the heart for me. But the great news is a man down the hall from me did get that organ that day. And of course, there was some controversy as to whether or not the organ was good or not, but it was okay for him at least. He got the organ, and I was able to actually shake his hand and congratulate him as he went to surgery. So that was definitely something that helped me along the way to see someone else receiving that great gift. Now, that was on May the 15th. That was my first missed heart transplant. Now, fast forward, May the 22nd. We're still in 2013. May the 22nd, just 7 days later, I've been listed as a status 1A on the top of the list now for 14 days or 2 weeks, basically. On May the 2nd, on May the 22nd, another heart came up. Now, this time it was about 7:45 in the evening on a Wednesday. And my wife and children, I know everybody that I know and love, they're in worship service. They're in midweek Bible study. And of course, I go ahead and text my wife, and I text my good friend Cliff Goodwin, the other preacher, and his wife, and I guess several people simultaneously, and said, I'm NPO again. And I knew that that was kind of code for most people, but I didn't know who would understand it. And basically, my wife didn't get the text. She had her phone on silent. She's teaching her Bible class at that point. But she does get back upstairs there, and Cliff says, I got this strange text from Jim. It says he's NPO till further notice. What's that mean? And she just kind of said, oh, that means he's getting a heart, maybe another heart. So they stayed around. They had the invitation song. They had a prayer, their Devo. They stayed around for that. And then she took off. The children, I think, went with some more good friends, the Harrises, and they took care of them. And basically, before it was over with, everybody ended up in Birmingham again. And of course, this was late night. And I already know the process can be long. I know the process can end with disappointment. So I'm kind of prepared for that and having to learn to deal with that as the night goes on. Now, once everybody arrived, I'm prepped again for surgery. I'm waiting on that. The doctors and nurses are there. I'd walked about 2 miles that day in the hall, so I got back out and started walking again. I didn't know anything else to do. The halls are dark. There's some little night lights there along the floor. That's it. But I'm walking in the hallway, spending some time in that, just kind of relaxing and thinking, honestly. And the doctor came by and he said, you don't have to walk anymore. You're getting a heart. And I said, no, I need to walk. So I kept walking. I had learned a long time ago something from if you will, what was the rehab specialist, something like that. And he told me you got to keep your legs under you. If you want to get out of the bed with success, you better put your legs under you before you go into that operating room. So I really heard that, listened to that, and I was trying to do it. But nonetheless, as the night went on, we got more and more news, and finally received news early morning hours of the 23rd that the heart was definitely going to be mine, and it was on its way. Of course, we didn't know anything about that at that point in time. And finally, they came and gave us the information. They said, we're going to take him down and prep him for surgery around 5 a.m. Of course, by then, some more friends and family got in there. Cliff Goodwin, Beth Goodwin. Again, I mentioned him often. They were there to support us. My parents were there and such. And so we go down to be prepped. Now, I'm going to stop right there because basically there's a whole lot to tell, believe it or not, from this point. But I've gotten you up from March of 2010 up until the point of being prepped for surgery about 5 a.m. on the 23rd. So we'll continue with this yet another day. Now, I want you to spend time in God's Word today. Focus on it any way that you can, and be sure the things that you know and do are right in the sight of God. This has been your Daily Dose, and I pray that you'll be encouraged.